one of my bosses rear ends my car, my authentic self does not. It's going to be a very different response, and these are all different forms. And so, just as much as the version of me that says, "Oh, well, the bumper didn't need it," I mean, that is just as authentic self as the presence I create on Facebook or on Twitter or on anything else. And so, I think saying we're limiting it is actually just as human as our every other interaction.
Michael, and then back there. Sorry.
Yeah, so I think like if we're talking about like identity construction, right, and all these things are socially constituted, but you actually have to physically create your profile online, which like pulls back the veil as to like what identity construction actually means, because you have to be like, I am a gendered male person, I am this, I am that, and the other thing. So I think like that process makes us so much more aware of like how we're presenting ourselves. Than just like the way that we in our everyday lives do that. And some people obviously are more aware of it than others, but it forces a lot more people to engage with that than might normally think about this.
Yes. Yeah, just a good one. And I think you have to consider the like permanence of online identity versus offline identity, as well as privacy. And your authentic, if there is an authentic self offline, you can kind of control it and change it. You can go home and just be your authentic self with you and your family members. But online, even if you change over time, that authentic self online from 10 years ago can still be present today.
Yeah. I think that's the reason Snapchat exists. I mean, it's the ephemeral self that, I mean, you can snap these things, but it still gives that particular space to be that kid, for that time and let that disappear. And I think that's one of the market pressures I think we see here. We don't want to have a forever self on the digital domain. Go back there. Oh, okay, sorry.
Okay, I was just going to say, I go to school right now with a very, very strong arts program to it. And it's kind of assumed sometimes that everybody is an extrovert, and if you are, you could. And I consider myself kind of a digital introvert, largely because of the permanence of what goes on. So that I don't feel comfortable doing one of myself out there. And so it means that if I do go out there trying to make a learning plan of some sort, that the whole process of putting something out there feels very artificial. Making myself put something on there for the purpose of putting something on there.
Yeah,
that's a good point. I feel like expressing myself because I feel like talking.
Can we just? I'd love to just piggyback on that, and I think maybe just at your tables or with small groups, have a look at these questions, and just because we focused, the conversation has sort of been around the spaces and our individual perspectives on it. But I think there's some interesting questions here that'll get more into what we want to end with, is the whole notion of the personal learning network. Talk about some of these, particularly around your best conversations, benefits, and maybe some of the other ones as well. So maybe just at your table for about 5 or 10 minutes, just see if you can kind of come to some sort of shared understanding around the varied experiences that you have with those spaces in particular.
We should leave the questions up there.
C'est là où est-ce que je posais tantôt la question. OK. Comment on peut approcher, redéfinir en utilisant les réseaux sociaux?
Mais ils n'ont pas adressé. J'ai pas compris. Ils n'ont pas adressé l'utilisation de réseaux sociaux. Mais pas l'utilisation. C'est pas des affaires. Si elle allait plus en détail dans les gens pourraient plus dire un amour personnel. Les gens plus dans leur truc personnel que leur vie.
We should talk briefly.
Non, regarde. Mais comment est-ce que, si tu comprends, c'est là que tu vas commencer les étapes à faire avec ta carte. Parce que la première carte, tu dis, OK, on se crée tout un Twitter account, puis on suit toutes 2-3 personnes. Puis on se revient dans 2 semaines, on regarde les posts. En éducation, qui sont top-notch. Comme tu donnes ces noms-là aux gens, Puis avec des étudiants qu'on pourrait voir la meilleure en maths, excellent. Puis dans 2 semaines, quand on va se revoir, on va parler d'un étude que tu as vu, que tu aimes. Je commence par ça, parce que les gens savent pas écouter. Quand c'est du côté professionnel,
OK, il y a ça, il y a cet aspect-là. J'irais aussi vers l'autre côté. Une fois par semaine, tu demandes au prof, et là on parle de Twitter, tu demandes au prof de Twitter quelque chose qui s'est passé en salle de classe. Un apprentissage qui s'est fait en salle de classe.
Avant
Tu le fais choisir par les élèves. Pour faire en sorte que les autres dans l'école ou les parents quels sont les apprentissages qui ont été faits? Parce que souvent, les élèves arrivent à la maison. Si c'est l'élève selon des critères, il pourrait choisir, mettons, il faut aller cette semaine, 15 minutes dans la semaine. Qu'est-ce qu'on a appris? Qu'est-ce qu'on a fait de différent? Puis, comment je peux dire, de qui on a pris soin cette semaine? Les élèves choisissent. Donc, un tweet par classe. Cette semaine, c'est l'apprentissage. C'est le balai, là.
Moi, je fais ça.
I'll tweet out the link.
Il y en a même pas de Twitter. Il y en a qui ont même pas de cellulaire. Dans mon école, il y en a même pas de cellulaire.
Go right into it.
Je pense que le premier semestre, je les instruirais comme comment regarder, c'est quoi un tweet, c'est quoi comme...
I like this first. What that is. But I think we'll
Yeah, okay. Yeah, you go right into it.
Moi, c'est différent. Moi, ils sont sur Facebook, ils sont pas Twitter. Moi, je suis plus sur Twitter que sur Facebook. Ouais.
Mon personnel, c'est Facebook. Mon professionnel, c'est Twitter.
Oui, mais la capsule sonore, à l'école, dans ta petite communauté avec les parents. Oui, je pourrais le faire. Il y a le blog aussi. Il y a tellement de manières pour rentrer en communication avec la communauté.
Oui, la communauté, c'est de passer de l'étape de dire je vais équilibrer qu'est-ce que je fais. C'est vraiment pas facile. C'est quoi c'est bien?
George Dean.
Alex, je vais demander.
Excuse me, Dean.
We have a question. It might be all in the translation. So, in your quadrant that you did, okay? So we practically, I think it's a good discussion you were doing. So we have this challenge of, when I was doing my quadrant, I was thinking more of my like what I am, like if my visitors like my users mostly like so I find that in my life I will post a lot of stuff that is my personal stuff. But when I get to Twitter, my it's mostly I look.
You look, yeah.
I look.
So then that would be probably more of a visitor.
Yeah. So I think because we're trying to figure out how we can bring this into our PLC school, and we have like a bunch of teachers that are like they have it, and a bunch of teachers that don't have it.
There's actually an entire workshop from David White that's on this particular piece. Talks more about the resident versus so that would be useful. I'm happy to send you the resources, and you might be able to take little pieces of it. But I think it's less about posting there. It's about taking more of
feeling a residence of a community is a bit different. Like if you actually feel like you have relationships there, being more of a resident. It's not so much that you just host things. I think it's a bit different because a visitor is someone maybe you visit often, but you're not really feeling like a resident. It's not like a home or a space that you would reside.
That's where we want to bring our teachers.
Well, it's not.
To be able to go after a while and not just like look at
So when you talk about
yeah, and they're just, I think ultimately it's a framework just to provide discussion. Like, ultimately, it doesn't matter where you fit. It's that you've had the discussion of where different people have different comfort zones. And you're not necessarily saying you have to live in Twitter to be a resident, but just that understanding how people view these spaces very differently from one another. I think that's a bit of a revelation. And not everyone's, I mean, even I did personal living network means that it should be a when I look at it, in my eyes, in my experience, it's very different from what you look at it. And it doesn't mean much better. People have different comfort levels and identities. To coexist. And, so, but I'm very happy if you send me an email. This is my last name. I can send you the email. Yeah, for sure. And I'll send it after tonight or something.
Help those people, but that's right. So like then actually provides value to writing about this. I know where you're coming from. That's a random piece of text that I
c'est une communauté à ce moment-là, puis c'est OK, c'est un tweet une fois par semaine de ce que vous avez fait, ce qui a été appris dans votre salle de en même temps, oui, aussi. Puis les élèves. C'est eux autres qui font ça, on va se tweeter ensemble. Ils ne peuvent pas le tweeter avant 13 ans. Je pense que c'est pas 13 ans. Mais si c'est le fun, tu fais le choix de regarder, on va tweeter ça cette semaine. Dans l'école même, ça fait oh wow, on fait ça, c'est intéressant. Pourquoi? Je pense pas.
I was talking even about all of a sudden something resonates.
Ça a été un apprentissage parmi la semaine que les élèves ont choisi. On veut que les gens savent qu'on a fait ça. Ah, le carrying, là, ça va faire quoi? Et peut-être que cette semaine-là, ça va être, ils vont choisir, bien, cette semaine, on a pris soin d'un ami. Cette semaine, on a pris soin d'un ami. Ça peut pas partir.
But it wasn't from birth.
Cette semaine, on a organisé une chanson pour aller visiter les personnes âgées à, comment ça s'appelle, là, le foyer de personnes âgées à Orléans. Ouais. On a organisé une chanson. Les élèves, ils ont appris, ils ont fait des chansons, ils ont fait des algoments, ils ont fait ça. Mais pour eux autres, ça a été le projet de la chanson pour aller
Go back in time.
Yeah, right. Make one for me. I don't know.
Je sais pas, puis là, je me dis, puis tu sais, tantôt, tu me posais des bonnes questions. OK, pourquoi, à quoi ça sert?
All right, so this conversation could probably go on indefinite, and I would love for you to do that. But we'd like to get to a couple of really maybe more nuanced ideas here that'll help tweak it. And just sitting in on a few conversations, we're not going to do a go around, but I know there's some really interesting points that have even just helped myself clarify. So Real quick, we're not going to spend a lot of time, but I'm just looking for some real quick feedbacks, not a dissertation here, but how do you define your PLN? Like, what would be the way, if somebody said, what's a PLN? You have 2 sentences, like, how would you define it? Anybody got one? I'll give you a second to think. When you got one, shoot your hand up or just shout it out, whatever. What is it?
People I follow to learn from.
People I follow and learn from, okay? Yeah.
I would add the people I follow to learn from and with. It's not just.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
All right. Anybody add, disagree, couple at the back?
Working with others to enhance educational learning experiences.
Okay.
Simplified, it depends.
It depends. Oh yeah, he's a cop-out guy. I've seen these guys before. All right. So
Let's go here.
Alex, okay.
Yeah, I was thinking that, I mean, one of the key questions I think that we hope that you can get to beyond this is the difference between a network and a community. And I think looking at, Schweer did some work, a colleague of mine from the University of Saskatchewan, on some of the characteristics of an online learning community, which I think applied to, they were looking at real communities, right? Face-to-face communities, and how do we actually apply that? So things like technology, and technology would be any type of communication tool. Like how do we actually communicate? That there is a history or a historicity they use in this particular sense. And I think that's important for many of us who've been on Twitter for a long time. That history, it really bonds us together in many ways. Also a future, the idea of that having a shared future or some goals to look towards. There's other things like autonomy, mutuality, participation, plurality, respecting other people's needs and goals. But the one thing that comes back, especially when you look at social capital research, is around the idea of trust. Nothing happens within that particular community without trust. Like it's not a community without some sense of trust. So thinking about that, ultimately we want to think about that idea. And maybe as we go on to the next part, what's the difference between a network and a community? Want to add to that?
Well, and just the idea that, in some senses, you think, what difference does it make? Why do we have to define the difference? And I agree, there's probably times where maybe it doesn't matter, but it does matter, especially around this idea of trust, because if my expectations of what this space is for is, oh, I trusted you and you somehow let me down, well, it's because we had different expectations of what this was. For me, maybe it was a community. I thought we were a community. I thought we did things together. And for another person, this was just my network, and so I don't have any obligation. So I think there is some, and I'm struggling with this in my own mind. It's why this is a great opportunity to talk about it. But like, when is it important to say this is a community? When is it important to say this is a network? And even Stephen Downs talks about groups as well as being sort of a third element of this. And no question that the lines aren't always defined, but I think it is important. Like when you look at this, especially that added notion of trust, and even I think this idea of history is kind of an interesting notion and future that is part of it. So I guess where we're just going to lay out here is sort of, here's where this is the Alec and Dean perspective of the state of the PLN. Take it for what it is, but this is again kind of where this is kind of a speed round, and we actually, when we're finished, kind of want you to think about so this slide here that again I have to apologize. I'm horrible at Photoshop. And George got really upset. I got a big lecture on Twitter DM when I put him in the ugly. But it was just, I couldn't think of like a third person to add. So for those of you who don't know, George is Alec's brother. I actually have, and I wore them today, I actually have socks with their picture on it right here. Like that. And I asked why Alex, I said, why is Alex's picture so big and George is so small? It's because he said George never paid for it. But anyway, but thinking about that, the reason I came up with that is because I think there's continually awesomeness around this idea of, and most of us are here because we've had some experience of that was amazing. But then there's stuff that's kind of just not great. And then there's actually some stuff that's really ugly. So we're going to do a quick one.
We'll start with good. So let's go. So besides the Pro D stuff that we've talked about today, so we're going to go beyond that particular piece. What sort of elements that we've seen? I often use the hashtag Shiny Happy Internet to see some of the great things that people are doing for one another online. Years ago, 5 years ago, actually, almost exactly 5 years ago, Dean surprised me with a video at one point, and he actually got people from Twitter, mostly, to actually celebrate my 40th birthday online. So I woke up that morning, turning 40, and it was amazing to see the people that actually came together and shared a birthday. And every once in a while, when I'm feeling down, I'll go watch this, and it's really kind of an interesting thing. Ultimately, talking about the difference between communities and networks, which I think is good. Okay, next one.
Well, this is my story. So this was again one of these wonderful stories. So a couple years ago, I reached a milestone in my life where I had this number with a 5 and a 0, and I guess it's a big deal. Anyways,
You got a long way to go.
I was away for 2 weeks before my birthday, and I kept getting pictures of packages that were coming to my house. My wife was saying it ended up actually happening that around 80 people from around the world sent me socks for my birthday. So I ended up with about 87 pairs of socks from people who just, again, some people I knew pretty well, other people I've never met, still never met to this day, but for whatever reason thought enough that they would send me a pair of socks, which was really, I mean, just kind of a cool, amazing thing. You think about that, and you try to explain that to your 84-year-old father, that people that I don't know are sending me socks. I don't know, like, what do you mean? Why would they do that? I don't know, Dad. Like, it's just this weird thing that we do. So awesome moments.
So other good examples, going into Cog Dog, which many of you know, Alan Levine from Strawberry, Arizona. His mother passed away, and everyone, of course, people knew who Cog Dog was, and they cared about him. And it was interesting, just a little, someone developed a hashtag cookie love because his mother really liked cookies. And then you saw people basically baking cookies, and this was actually taking Darren and Jabiz and Shanghai, I think, or whatever else, and people just baking cookies randomly on the internet and then giving them to people randomly, which is another thing that was really kind of an interesting and neat tribute to people through Cog Dog. Other things, and these are things I've shared in presentations I've done. This one, a random guy on the internet basically loses his mother. In this particular case, she's got oxygen tubes coming from over her face. He basically asked the internet, Reddit in this particular case, is anyone out there who has mad Photoshop skills who can fix up this picture? And then you saw really good examples of people just coming together randomly without a particular identity, mostly anonymous, who came to the call. And it's just a mindy little thing.
That's
I love
my
it.
favorite.
That's my favorite one. If you notice, there's like a gash out of the vinyl here and over here, and this guy fixed a chair. That was how we basically saved the world that particular day. But I love that sort of idea. Maybe that's not a community, maybe it's still a network, because really that was just a one-time thing.
But he did post on Reddit afterward, like, this is like the best community. This is why I come here, because people do stuff like this. And so, there's a question, like, is that a community? Is that, like, I don't know. For him, totally a community. Did it have things like, we looked at the elements before, certainly a lot of trust there and a lot of reciprocity, but,
And you see other examples, like some guy does ask for the same thing. Can you put my finger on the Eiffel Tower? But then people do it very differently, right? So it's very different. Like, they're not quite as helpful as the other people. This one looks like it was MS Paint or something.
That's my Photoshop right there.
Basically. So you get all sorts of interesting, and that again, that's sort of that playfulness which Dean talks a lot about, and that joy that he brings in.
So let's do a bit of a speed round here. And so if you can maybe have a story. It doesn't mean that someone gave you socks or they did something for you on the internet, but just thinking about, like, what's your thing that you can say, this was sort of an act of kindness. I suppose all of those have that theme around, but just something that, and it doesn't have to be big at all, but just something that sticks in your memory is, that was a really interesting moment that either I gave, somebody gave, or I saw this idea of that you would actually say that's community when that happens. So I'm just looking for a speed round. So I know some of you have to think, but if you have it, if you got an idea, Hadley.
I put out a call on Twitter for a study on feudal Japan, and Barbara Sakamoto, who lives in Japan, got back to me with a whole list of websites. And then the next thing that I knew, a box arrived in the mail with Japanese treats and pictures, and then she connected me to a Buddhist monk in Japan who would meet with my kids, and we ended up Skyping with them. It was just one of those amazing. She didn't have to do it, and not only answered give me the websites, but all the rest.
Sure, Brett, and then Maribel.
Last year, I was here at EduCon. I told the table here. Sunday of EduCon, my wife got rushed to the hospital. Chris went to him. I was supposed to present that day. I said, I need help. And I got to get back home. Chris got 3 kids. You're getting on a different plane. You're going to get a cab for him. You're going to tell everybody that his session's canceled. Half hour later, I was on my way home with my wife. Long story short, I spent 12 weeks in hospital, rehab center, recovering from life-saving surgery. Wow. And the number of people, especially Bill Farrader and Tom Murray, who reached out and said, hey, Brett needs our help. I started getting cards in the mail, money to help pay for babysitting, groceries for my kids. Just, I would have had that without this community.
Amazing.
And so,
nice, isn't it? Okay, you gotta follow that, Mary. That better be good. Come on.
No pressure.
Out that somebody who actually wasn't there with, but had seen me sitting, and it was someone I knew from Twitter, had seen me sitting there, carried the bag, looked at the panel, and found me after the panel to give me back my bag. And just the fact that like that community, that even though we weren't sitting together, it's like, oh, that's Mary Beth, and like the idea that I find her later and that care was pretty awesome, but not as awesome for sure.
It's a good story. Adina.
One of the first ones I participated in, and it really kind of caught me, was Barbara Beretta, who's an educator out of Southern California, lost her home in one of the California wildfires. Lost her home completely, and her garage was lined with bookshelves, all filled with books. Lost all of it. And people came together, all just knew to Twitter, and collected money to buy her a Kindle first of all, so she could do that, and just kind of replace that collection for her. And that was like the first thing that she got back, was that was a huge thing that she lost. And for her, having people come together and give her that huge thing that was such a huge part of her life was just a massive showing of community. And again, everyone only knew each other through Twitter.
Jennifer?
I guess the one that's more personal, I was kind of trying to think of the one that's not as personal, but one that's more personal. We were talking about networks last night, and the one that I think I've been a member of the longest, I had to go to the hospital to go see my sister, and I posted out to my friends, she's passing and I don't know what to do. And they stayed with me online all night until she was gone the next day.
And just fill in the blanks a bit here. Like this was the Weight Watchers Club that emerged into sort of a mummy club over time. I mean, it was sort of it went from
for like 15 years.
Yeah. So that's sort of interesting, the way it's the people that really remained together. So it wasn't so much about a platform or whatever it was about here's a bunch of people together, which is really obviously at the core of what we mean by community, which is another problem. We talk about Twitter as a community. It doesn't make any sense, right? Like, that's not what a community is. It's maybe a space where people sometimes, it's the technology part of the community perhaps, but it's not that. So those are, and I know more, we could share more, but I just sort of moved down a bit of a different path here. So the bad, if this isn't so awful, but certainly the idea of social media actually isn't really that new. And there's a book that I've read called Writing on the Wall of Social Media, the First 2,000 Years. And it really sort of helped me grasp the idea that our desire to connect with people at an individual level is entirely one of the most human things we've ever done. And our problem is we have the 20th century of mass media that has taken over the way we've communicated with broadcast, which is not, it's an anomaly really in human history. So the idea that social media is something new is a little bit off. Yes, it has certainly some challenges to it, but at its basic level, it's a way for people to sort of gather and connect. And I'm always hesitant not to be, when I look back at, it used to be this and that, I love this quote about nostalgia, that people get crazy about a lot of things or nostalgic about things they were crazy about the first time around. So I don't mean to do that. However, when I do look back, and we just had a brief conversation over here about sort of our early days of Twitter, sort of before there was such a thing as hashtag. And I wrote this last week just because it was actually in response to something George wrote around that's maybe if Twitter's changing, maybe it's more of our perspective than it is the actual Twitter, which definitely there was a lot of validity to that. But then I looked at, there actually are some things around the way that the tool is changing, that it's forcing us to do things differently. And I would almost say gamify the system. So people talk about how do I gain more followers? Like that wasn't even a question I thought of at the beginning. It was just like a bunch of people, and all of a sudden you got followers because somebody decided that was the thing to do. You didn't game it. Because, like I see people now that have like a jillion followers, and they're like, what did they do? Like, how did they do? I don't even know how they did. Like, there's tricks behind it. And I talked about this before about now we're trying to provide rules and guidelines, and is it sort of taking away from the way that we interact organically, and the whole idea of branding just kind of irritates me to no end. And even this post I wrote just because I was really frustrated, and I actually talked about how Snapchat is actually becoming an interesting place, and you were talking before about how sort of having that voice for kids to sort of out they understand, and I've had great conversations with my 17-year-old daughter about Snapchat because she's helping me understand that this is actually an interesting place, and she hates that I use it. But that's fine. I'm learning how to interact in that space and what that means.
Is that one's yours?
Yeah, I mean, this was actually just a recent post that someone shared with me. It was sort of somebody talked about being an introvert, and this is actually really challenging the fact that, you know, the whole idea of collaboration in general is a huge theme that we want, and again, there's so many awesome things about moving from a profession that's been so isolated to something that does really think about community. At the same time, for a lot of people, the way that's being thrust upon them is draining. It's really hard. Like, what does this mean that I have to connect with people? And you know, somebody talked about before about I don't think I still here talked about you talked about the fact that going into that space meant I got to do some things I don't know if I want to do in terms of opening myself up, and that has to be honored. Like, I think, you know, telling people you got to get on, you got to do this. Well, maybe you don't, right? So trying to understand then. So what does that mean? Like, where do we fit around this idea of community and networks for all kinds of people that find these spaces annoying and awful to people that find them invigorating?
So let's clump the next one.
Sure.
So then there's the ugly piece. Just to give an example, if anyone's followed me on Facebook or Twitter, you've probably seen that my identity, and Dean's as well, both of our people use our photographs to create fake profiles, romantic profiles, to get involved with women on all sorts of dating sites and Facebook sites and so on. So for instance, if I look at any given time, there's like hundreds of different fake my pictures, my kids' pictures, my family's pictures, on places like this. So there's adult Albert Raymond, Hoot on Valentine. Here's my OkCupid profile. I'm good in talking with people. I am good in singing. I can play guitar. I can write poems. What people notice about me, the way I dressed, I mean my dressing, my style of dressing. So I'm sure I can write a better profile than that.
Get good at Valentino, that's
sure.
for sure.
Yeah.
I'll tell you.
I've got all sorts of profiles, and people don't. First of all, you never see me in a tie, which is one thing. And then just the basic digital literacy that when you look at so many different fake profiles or fake passports, people should be able to figure them out, but they're often not. There's me with, now it used to be my daughter, but now it's some sort of ghost dog of some sort that has been photoshopped in my lap. There's me after a really tragic accident, but right before they asked for a lot of that. That's not a picture of me, just my head that seems to hover over my body at some point. But those sorts of things have been defrauding many women in this particular case, and they're rampant. I mean, they're incredible. And then we have to think, I'm able to find these things because I have it's both the problem, because I have so many pictures out there, but for people to be able to find me, they can find the real me, I guess. And for many of you who have only perhaps let that one, person in, that suspect person into your network, they may be harvesting your profile pictures. You may not know that this is happening to you. And there's many people who are very surprised by this. I don't know if you want to talk about this because this is happening to you.
Yeah,
it's a hassle on social
media.
And
it's one of those things too where, like, people talk to Alec and I, like, what do you do about it? I don't know. I mean, I try to report it, like, and people want simple answers, like, just, scrub your Facebook, don't use it. Like, that's not necessarily the answer either. So I guess it's to point out, it sort of is. Like, I wish there were simpler solutions, but there aren't.
At this point, I have to be like, I got kicked off Facebook a week ago because they didn't believe I was me anymore. I'm back on after I sent my passport the third time, but I feel like I have to be on Facebook now because I have to be there to basically sort of relay the message that these people are being scammed. Like if I'm not there, someone else will take my place, which is kind of scary. Beyond that, I mean, that's just more of a personal thing. Kathy shared with me this last week just the idea that the geography of hate, the number of racist, misogynist, hateful content that we often see in Twitter. And remember, a personal learning network is the way that you see a particular network. People see it very differently depending on how they are situated in that particular network. So for instance, a good example, and this is, again, Katya, I'll bring up your post. So I can post things that would be exactly the same as Katya over here, and she gets trolls after her who call her horrible names and that sort of thing. And it's just, they're the exact same tweets. And we have to understand that this is very different for people. So when we ask our students to put their students on, or when we ask people to be on this particular space, we have to recognize that this is very different. No matter your situation, your experience in these particular social networks, we're asking a lot of you. And so I think we have to continue to think about that the days of Twitter, when it was some sort of obscure little tool, when we were just all being there, it's very different.
Well, and that's why too, like I hesitate in even projecting my own experience, partly because I know everybody's experience, but partly because of perspective of women and people of color that I can't tell them because they've experienced things that I haven't. And so I feel very hesitant to say, well, here's how you do it because it worked for me. Well, great. I mean, wow. So it just challenges my own self in that conversation.
Yeah. So I guess from this, are there those negatives that you wanted to share? That please.
Well, I don't know, you and I had this conversation.
Yes.
And I wrote a post about a member, I would say, of the Edgecombe family who lost this past week. Tragic loss. And there was a lot going on mental health wise with him. He was an educator in New York. And my feeling was it made me really reflect on these connections that we make through social media. What do they really mean? And what are these, it's great that social media allows us to connect with so many people, but then if those connections aren't a community, if they don't have that trust and these personal stories, then what is the purpose of it? And is it actually more harmful than good? Because if I feel like I'm connected to someone by just spending like 10 seconds writing a post, what does that do to our relationships as a society? Especially since our kids are growing up with these kinds of relationships and they're going to be the ones that are going to be running the world. And so just kind of, to me, that's the ugly piece of this is, what do these connections mean? And are we losing that sense of connection because we're redefining connection as being, I'm connected to this person through this very shallow social media tie.
And yeah, I've been thinking about Devin a lot in this session as well. And, I think on your post, somebody had responded, Mary Beth, and they said, like, it's easy to keep track of people until they stop posting, really. So, we knew what was going on with Devin until he stopped posting. And then the stream just keeps on going and you don't even realize that he's kind of vanished for a while. So unless you you thought of him at random and you say like, hey, we haven't heard from you in a while or something like that. I know there were a few people who had been in contact with him, but it is really upsetting to me because I know I felt very closely connected with him and he was very important in my growth as an educator.
And see, like for me, that's an interesting one because I would definitely have said he was part of my network.
Yeah.
As horrible as that is, and you talked about it, which is interesting. You said like we've let him down, because obviously your connection and maybe yours too felt like this was more of a community and somebody should have done something somewhere. So that's kind of an interesting idea of that blurring that I'm trying to
It made me think. I wrote a post quite some time ago, and it was around if Twitter disappeared tomorrow, what endures? What's left? What actually are those relationships that we created? Are there other passageways that we can get to those people that we care about? And so if that's thinking about what actually endures, what's left after the tool has left us? And I think we have to think about that. And I was actually looking through tweets, and and the interactions that you have with someone. And it was really interesting to see that's all that's left in some ways, just the interactions that you have with someone. It's kind of sad. I mean, it's really sad, tragic. Yes. So I'm sorry, I cut you off there from board.
I think sometimes we don't realize how very different the online world is for people who lack privilege. I follow Roxane Gay, who is an African American and Black female author and woman in higher education. And I'm so grateful to her because she will engage with trolls, at least sometimes. In her shoes, I would block people immediately and not even talk with that. But she engages, and then as a result, I have an opportunity to see what Twitter can be for someone who lacks privilege. I, a year or so ago, read something far into the Gamergate situation, read something of it that really struck me that I tweeted out, and immediately started getting very, very hateful tweets. And I thought, oh my God, I've tweeted one thing about this. Those women involved much more deeply in Gamergate. I can't even wrap my head around what that was for them. So I think for all of the joys of this online world, we need to sort of make an effort to be aware of what it's like for people in a very different position.
So it's always nice at the end of a session to take a bow and wrap it and have a sad story like that too. But
we should have put the good at the end.
Yeah, but yeah, totally should have changed it. But this was supposed to be a conversation, and so while I know I haven't come up with like, oh, now I get it, right? Now I know how to. I think what we're trying to get at is these are the questions that these are the questions that we should be asking. Continue to ask, because they play such an important part of our lives, and to sort of carelessly go about our business without, which your story is really powerful, Jen, about, noticing how do other people interact? Like what happens with a Devon? How do we help people just even, get some of the goodness that we've shared about the good stuff? Like how do we get people there so that they can do that, and yet at the same time acknowledge, hey, this is not right and this is horrible. It's a complicated thing. I mean, that's what Dana Boyd's work is about. I just think it's a fruitful conversation for me, just to get a little bit greater understanding of, I hadn't thought about that before. So if you left here thinking, I hadn't thought about that before, I think it's a bit of a win. So anyways, I think we're 4:30. So thank you guys for coming. Thank you.